This is definitely one of the more overlooked elements of Warhammer 40k. Hello and welcome to Epic Flail 40k Tactics. My name's Luke, and this week I will be mostly talking about micro versus macro strategy, more specifically applying this kind of thinking to improve our games of 40k. Over the many years that I've played this game competitively and run 40k tournaments, I've observed that some players seem to have an uncanny ability to consistently make winning plays, and it can't all just be their lists. They have a solid understanding of these two strategic layers around micro and macro strategies. And by the end of this video, you'll have an understanding of how mastering both macro and micro strategy can elevate our games of 40k to a whole new level. Let's get started. First and foremost, I want to clarify what I'm talking about when I say micro and macro strategies. If this is the first time you're hearing this, then at the macro level, we're talking about the big picture, holistically, what we're trying to do with our strategy and our army. Overarching game plan, what our army is trying to do at a very basic level. And the micro strategy is getting a bit deeper and can change depending on the matchup or often how turns unfold in the game. That's very broadly speaking. And to clarify this a bit further, one of the simplest ways I can illustrate this is the comparison of World Eaters versus Tau. The World Eater strategy is to be the aggressor in the game, to run forward and threaten big parts of the board. Doesn't necessarily have to make turn one charges, but it absolutely wants to be running up the field, staging, hiding out of line of sight, threatening key objectives or areas of the board, and get up close and personal in combat because that's where it's really strong. Conversely, Tau absolutely do not want to be getting too close to the enemy. They want to be staging but in a different way, moving around the board and getting key objectives where they can, but also in doing so creating killing fields across the table and threatening areas of the board at range, ultimately wanting to leverage their strength, which is shooting, and not get caught up in combat. So there we have the macro elements, and how we could apply this in our armies and our games is identifying these key things with our armies and understanding what that macro strategy is at a very basic level. What does our army want to do in a vacuum, as it were, before we worry about who we're up against, where are its strengths, where are its weaknesses, what do I want to be aiming for a lot of the time. Custodes is a good example of an army that has a very consistent game plan of just trying to run stuff onto the objective and hold an objective and threaten those points with tough, durable units. That's its oftentimes plan A. You see a similar thing with demons at the moment with the Great Unclean One. Often they'll just barrel that big lump forward and sit on an objective and just be an absolute nuisance with it. That's its macro strategy. That's what it's entering into the game thinking that's plan A, if you like. It's a good way of thinking about it, actually. Macro is kind of like, what are we wanting to do in an ideal world? If this is something that's completely new, it's not a bad way of thinking about this to begin with. And with that information, that should hopefully give us a roadmap that will outline where we want to be during each phase of the game or as the turns unfold. So if we have a faction like Demons, for example, and we're thinking about doing that, the Great Unclean One, then we want to be thinking about setting up so it has the best chance of moving and advancing onto an objective in the opening turn of the game. If we hide it at the back of the board, worried about our opponent's guns, then not going to be leaning into its big strengths necessarily. Understanding our faction's macro strategy is fundamental because it will help us dictate our list building, our deployment, and our early turns. It's worth noting that our macro strategy can change depending on our matchups. For example, if we have a very melee-focused army running into something like Death Guard, that can strike first and do a lot of damage. And so how we might traditionally engage with that army as a melee army is going to have to be adjusted. Our macro strategy is going to have to change. Might have to play a bit of a different game, go for other targets, not give our opponent an easy chance of activating that unit and getting the most out of it. The key takeaway with this scenario is if we have an idea of what our game plan is, understanding our list, understanding how our faction works, how our detachment works, and its strengths, weaknesses, etc. is fantastic, but it's important not to get bogged down on that. And this is a common thing that I see when people go up against bad matchups, thinking, I can't execute my macro strategy. They're so married to this idea of my army list does this. The identity of this faction is X. And if I can't execute X because of Y, then I don't know what to do. I had a situation the other week when I played my Genestealer Cults into Death Guard. I had a lot of MSU units and there were a lot of Flamers and very resilient units. And I had to really think about how I engaged with that army. I couldn't just deep strike down with abandon because of Overwatch basically killing whatever I would put in front of it, unless it was a 20-strong block of neophytes. It meant I had to change things up. So that's just one little example of how understanding your macro strategy is important, but being prepared to adapt it on the fly as we start playing against a more difficult matchup or an army we're not used to playing, being prepared to change things up. or evolve during the course of a game. A common place where I see people not react to change is if they make a play that doesn't pay off. We go for it, killing a durable target, be it something like Angron or Magnus or Mortarion or a big Imperial Knight, and we move in, we try to kill that big target, it doesn't go in our favour, and then that unit's left to then activate. Obviously it's frustrating when those things happen, but that's a big moment where we have to then think, okay, now we've got a unit there which we hadn't accounted for and it's going to cause havoc. How does that affect our plan A? Because we had a macro strategy plan going into that turn of deleting that unit, hasn't happened. So now we have to be able to adapt. It's quite a big moment in the game when things like that don't go our way. How do we respond to that? Or how do we actually deal with that? And conversely, if we have that key centerpiece unit and we've put it in a position where we thought it shouldn't die, I should be able to take punishment here, I've got some defensive tricks, but things don't go our way and we've set up our turn to have that key piece and now it's gone. So adaptability in terms of our overarching strategy is really important. By the way, if you're enjoying this content, then check out Epic Flail HQ. Part 2 of this video will be available exclusively on Epic Flail HQ, and you can view that along with other members-only videos for just $2.99 a month. And not only that, you get access to our ever-growing Discord, as well as it being the place where you can watch UKTC coverage. So after you've watched this video in full, of course, check out Epic Flail HQ. What about the micro then? So I talked about some of the nuances and interaction between different armies and factions, and really that is the obvious elephant in the room point to begin with. The more games we play, the more we will understand how our units, at a more granular level, a more micro level, interact with other units. And this is where the correct order of activations, timing, target priority, all comes into play. In the movement phase, for example, a micro play can often be the difference between a close game and a whitewash. If we're moving a unit, we don't just want to be thinking about reaching objectives, think about positioning within the objective area. Do we want to stay in cover? Can we pivot a vehicle so that it's going to be obscured? Do we actually want to stay in cover? Are we setting up for a charge in our next turn? Have we positioned too close to a wall so we're then going to get charged through the wall? So having a purpose with our movement. A common micro level mistake I see is players just moving things without thinking in that way and not planning ahead as to where they're going to be. As a Genestealer Cult player, a big one is the icons to resurrect models. If I've spread out to try and screen stuff and not be on the objective, I try to make sure that the last model that I want alive, the icon bearer, is on the objective, because that's the one that can resurrect other models. Obviously, I don't want to remove that model as a casualty, but I also want to be on the objective. So if I've left that model off of the objective in an effort to screen, that could be a recipe for disaster, because if that unit gets mauled but not killed, and I don't have that model left to be able to resurrect in the following turn, that could be a real pain. One guy left alive with one gun, that's not likely to do anything, versus having the model with the icon on the objective that could actually resurrect multiple guns, as well as increasing the chances of out-OCing that objective. We want to maximize our reach and our angles whilst minimizing our exposure to retaliation. Target priority is a big one. Rather than just dumping a bunch of fire into a juicy target, we want to be thinking about our firing order, making sure we're getting the buffs we want if that's a relevant thing in our army, especially if we're facing into an army with multiple layers of defensive buffs or things like Feel No Pain. We'll want to chip away with low damage weapons first to reduce those abilities, and then bring in the high damage stuff. This is particularly important with things like multi-wound models. We don't want to be in a situation where we're firing into a unit that's got a model left in that unit on 1 wound, and then we kill that with a melter gun, and then the next guns we fire only do single damage wounds against the target that's left with multiple wounds. If we'd changed the order, we could have blinked off the final wound of the guy left on 1 wound, and then use the melter to do more damage into the next model that had its full wounds remaining. And it's things like that where I see people sometimes rush, not take the time to necessarily apply things in the right order. Talked about adaptation earlier, and if we consider a scenario where we're controlling a middle objective and our opponent has deployed units on both flanks, our macro strategy might have been to hold that middle objective, protect it at all costs. But in a dynamic game, a game where we're being adaptable, sticking to that rigid plan can be a liability. Maybe the better option is to abandon the middle objective temporarily, draw opposing units in and set up a micro play that catches those units off guard, isolates those vulnerable units, and it's this sort of adaptation that can swing games. Another prime example is the use of cheap units to bait Overwatch. Cheap units can also be used to screen charges, so we can throw these inexpensive units into a potentially dangerous situation just to draw out opponent stratagems. These kind of layered plays really define competitive 40k, thinking about every play that we're making, not just reacting and going, oh, unit there, I've got flamers, Overwatch. It's like, great, I wanted you to do that, fantastic. If you just paused a moment and thought, oh, no, just because I can Overwatch you doesn't mean I want to Overwatch you. I'll save it for the more threatening units you've got in reserve. It's about squeezing value from every unit that we have, making the most out of every inch of movement and the dice rolls, understanding how our units interact with other units and making plays that give us the best possible opportunities to either score or make kills. A big part of understanding our macro and micro strategies comes from list building and understanding our list really well. And I've made a video about that here, but that's all from me for now. Part 2 of this video will be available on Epic Flail HQ. In the meantime, thanks very much for watching. Keep rolling those dice and stay tuned for more.